The Orioles had the day off on Monday, so I've got a chance to answer your Orioles questions. Like, what is the future for Coby Mayo? Who will be in the Orioles lineup next season? And who's the O's closer right now with Craig Kimbrel struggling? We'll get to those Orioles questions and more coming up on this mailbag edition of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, August 6th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are opening up the mailbag. Got 9 questions to answer on today's show, all from you, the listeners. Thank you so much if you sent in your questions. We'll talk about plenty of topics, including Coby Mayo, including Eloy Jimenez, including Heston Kjerstad, Burch Smith, Sir Anthony Dominguez. We'll get to a lot of guys and a lot of questions on this mailbag episode. And this mailbag episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sport stops sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So we'll kick right into this mailbag. Thank you so much if you sent in your questions. Again, if you want to get your questions in for future mailbags, you can email us, lockedonorioles@gmail.com, or you can leave your questions right here in the YouTube comments. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Got 9 questions to get to today, all from you, the listeners, all about the Orioles. And we will kick it off with a question that came a little bit from Zachariah over email, a little bit from Jake via Twitter. I kind of combined the two into one. Zachariah asked, what are the odds that Eloy Jimenez would return to the Orioles in 2025? And Jake asked, is Eloy Jimenez more of an Aaron Hicks type or a Delmon Young type for the Orioles? Kind of combine these both because they are Eloy Jimenez questions. Now, I would say that the chances for Jimenez to be back with the Orioles next year, and again, it's been 4 games. He is 5 for 8, but it's a super small sample size. We still got 2 months of watching this guy in an Oriole uniform. The chances aren't high because of what his contract looks like. Now, he got kind of a mini extension with the White Sox, and it could end after this season. The Orioles kind of traded for him as if he were a rental, but he does have 2 team options left on his deal for 2025 and 2026. What that means is if the team would like to bring him back, they have the option to at a set amount of money. The issue is Jimenez's option for next year is $16.5 million, and his option for 2026 is $18.5 million. Now, a couple of years ago, that looked like a much easier decision for a team, theoretically the White Sox, to make. But now, because of the injuries and the struggles, even if Jimenez puts together a hot 2 months, I'm not sure the Orioles are going to want to give him $16.5 million to come back next year when there may not even be a spot ready for him in the everyday lineup or even close to being an everyday player in this lineup. And for Jimenez, not that he gets the decision because it's an Orioles decision, it's a team option, but if he hits well, he's going to want to go sign a bigger deal with a team that could play him every day if he stays healthy and produces over the final 2 months of this season. Now, there is a chance that the Orioles would decline the team option and then bring him back on a more team-friendly 1-year deal, like for $7 or $8 million, to have him be a bench bat and a part-time player in their lineup, certainly if he does produce. I mean, he's only 27 years old. There still could be a lot in that bat and in that body, but it's just so many injuries. I think this is kind of a patchwork addition for the final 2 months for the Orioles. Now, I could see him being a Delmon Young type where he comes in and gets the big hit for the Orioles, but I've actually been comparing him more so to Aaron Hicks. Now, they're not the same player. Hicks, obviously, a much better defensive outfielder. Jimenez is a guy at this point that you don't want to put in the field at all. He's basically just a DH. But the reason why I compared the two is A, both have had some injury struggles, and B, both were with teams, with fan bases that were basically trying to run them out of town. Now, it was a little different for Hicks because the Yankees were good and Hicks was bad. For the White Sox, it was the White Sox are dreadful, and Jimenez is honestly not as bad a performer in Chicago as Hicks was in New York before he was released. But Yankee fans wanted nothing to do with Aaron Hicks. They were making his life miserable. And honestly, as we saw after the trade, White Sox fans wanted nothing to do with Eloy Jimenez, and they were making his life miserable. And when Aaron Hicks came over At the end of last May, when Cedric Mullins went on the injured list, we said, why are you signing Aaron Hicks? He's been a disaster for the last year and a half for the Yankees. And all of a sudden, he was a well above league average hitter, playing good defensive outfield in all three positions for the Orioles down the stretch. And you could argue was their most impactful player in the playoffs when they were swept by the Rangers. Like, that is what Aaron Hicks gave to the Orioles last year. I'm not sure if Jimenez can produce to that level. He also only has 2 months instead of 4 months to do it. But I compare him to Hicks because sometimes you just need that change of scenery. When you are not in a good place, it is hard to be good at your job if you hate your work environment. Probably a weight lifted off him and his shoulders coming over here. Maybe he can succeed. And that's why I compare him more to an Aaron Hicks type. Second question, it also comes from Zachariah via email, who, shout out to Zachariah, sent some fantastic questions via email. Didn't get to all of them, but threw a couple of them into the mailbag here. Zachariah wants me to power rank which American League teams you would like to see the least in the postseason, aka the teams you would want the Orioles to avoid in the postseason series because you are theoretically afraid that they will beat the O's in a series. So I'll be generous here and say there are 9 other teams besides the O's still in the running for a playoff spot. That includes the Rays, who are 5 games out of a wild card. I know they just sold at the deadline, but the Rays are the Rays. You never know what they could do. And that also includes the Rangers, who are 5.5 back in the AL West, but they've just got so much talent. They're still close enough that they could make a run to get there. And of course, they're the defending World Series champions, so I'm going to put them in there. So I'm going to go from number 9 to number 1, with number 1 being the scariest team to me and number 9 being the team that doesn't concern me at all. Number 9 is the Rays. I know they are the Rays. They didn't scare me before they started trading off players. Then they shipped off Isaac Paredes and Zach Eflin and Jason Adam. And just to name a few of the guys that they traded away at this deadline, that team got worse, even though the Rays are maybe the best team in baseball at reloading their roster quickly with talent from AAA. They're just not as good. They've still been winning games. They just went in and won a series in Houston against the Astros this weekend. So they're still playing solid baseball. They're still over 500. But the way that roster is constructed, I think the Orioles could breeze through a postseason series against the Rays. Number 8 on my list would be the Minnesota Twins. They were a solid baseball team with a good lineup. They've got a solid starting pitching. It's a good bullpen at the back end. But just the lack of playoff experience and success. It was a team that the only move they made at the deadline was adding Trevor Richards, who's quite frankly at best has been a mediocre middle reliever for the Blue Jays this year. Richards has been really good in the past, but certainly not this season. That's your only addition. I get that you feel your team is pretty well-rounded, but I don't know. I know the Twins are good, but something about them just, it doesn't really scare me at all. Number 7 on the list is the Mariners. If they had any semblance of offense, they would be higher because they have, I think without argument, probably a top 3 starting rotation in Major League Baseball. And it is scary to face that in the postseason. But in the playoffs, you need somebody to hit, and the other teams have good pitchers as well. And even though the Mariners did go ahead and add Justin Turner and Randy Arozarena to their lineup, and objectively it got better after the trade deadline, that lineup, especially if Julio Rodriguez is still injured, is a disaster. And if you want to play one certain kind of team in the postseason, it would probably be a team that just can't hit. I'd be okay with playing Seattle. The O's have taken both series from the Mariners already this year. I'd be fine with that one. Number 6 is the Royals. Now, the Orioles also won both series against Kansas City this year, but they were stressful series. They took 2 out of 3 in Baltimore. The O's had to get 2 walk-off wins, and then they somehow found a way to win 2 of 3 in Kansas City a couple weeks after that. Both those series were early in the season, but that is just a scrappy team. The thing with Kansas City is while their rotation's been really good, Cole Reagan, Seth Lugo have been great, they didn't add enough at the deadline. That lineup is super top-heavy. I mean, Bobby Witt is firmly cemented himself as number 2 behind Judge for AL MVP voting right now. I mean, Bobby Witt in July was one of the best players we've ever seen in a calendar month. And Salvador Perez does his thing, and Vinny Pasquantino, but Maikel Garcia hasn't taken the next step they thought he would, and MJ Melendez has taken a step back, and the bottom of that order is just not scary at all. They did add to their bullpen. They got Lucas Erceg and Hunter Harvey at the deadline, but it's did they really do enough? It's still not an amazing bullpen. That team scares me because they're scrappy, and maybe it's a little bit of feelings from the last time the O's played the Royals in a postseason series, but that's why they kind of end up near the middle. Number 5 is the Rangers. Listen, they are not a good baseball team, but they have Jacob deGrom coming back at some point, and we saw what happened last year. They weren't the best team in baseball, but they got hot and looked like a killer team in the playoffs, so that's why only reason why they're up as high as 5 on the list. Number 4 is the Red Sox. I think they're a really underrated team overall. Right now, they're the first team outside of the AL playoff picture. The rotation is good, doesn't have an ace stud, but it's really good. The offense is underrated. Their bullpen is solid enough with kind of some unknown names, and dumb stuff can happen at Fenway Park that allows worse teams to win ball games. That's why they're number 4 on my list. Number 3 would be the Astros. They're not the same team they used to be, but they're still right there in the AL West picture. I still think they're going to win the AL West once again. And yeah, they've been decimated by some injuries and their lineup isn't the same, but they're going to get Kyle Tucker back with Yordan Alvarez and Bregman, and Altuve is going to come back, and they're still going to be a nightmare to face. Their rotation is getting healthy and looking really good. Their bullpen's been a little shaky, but it's still like Abreu, Presley, and Hader, and those guys talent-wise is one of the best back ends of the bullpens in baseball. That ballpark plays well to them. I do not want to see the Astros, even this version of them. Number 2 is the Yankees. Listen, they have their flaws. Don't get me wrong. The starting pitching hasn't been as good. The offense has had its struggles, but they have Aaron Judge and Juan Soto hitting back-to-back in their order, and that is always going to scare you, especially at Yankee Stadium. The only reason why they're not number 1 is because the rest of the lineup outside of Judge and Soto, I still think the O's would beat them in a playoff series, but those two guys elevate that team so much. And number 1 on the list is the Cleveland Guardians, the team the O's just went in and split a 4-game series with over the weekend. This is the one team I would be legitimately scared of if the Orioles faced them in a postseason series in the American League. Their starting rotation leaves a lot to be desired, but when you shrink it in the playoffs, it gets a little better. Their offense is just hard to get out. They got a great bats at the top of the order. They got really sneaky bats at the bottom half, and they've got the best bullpen in baseball. You honestly just got to get to the 5th with the lead, and the Guardians, kind of similar to those mid-2010s Royals, can completely shut you down after that, and that makes them scary, and that puts them number 1 on my list. Third question of the day also came from Zachariah, but many others. Adam asked this via email. We got a few other questions like this. What do you expect the 2025 Orioles lineup to look like? So let's assume that the Orioles on opening day are facing a right-handed starting pitcher. Now, this is what I think the lineup would look like. Jackson Holliday leading off, playing second. Adley Rutschman catching and hitting second. Gunnar Henderson hitting third, playing short. Anthony Santander, re-signing him in right field, hitting fourth. Ryan O'Hearn picking up his option, hitting fifth and playing first base. Heston Kjerstad is my DH and hitting sixth. Colton Cowser playing left field and hitting seventh. Jordan Westberg at third base, hitting eighth. And Cedric Mullins, still with the ball club, is hitting ninth and in center field. If you're wondering about a couple of guys, I do think the Orioles trade Ryan Mountcastle in the offseason, and I do think they go into next year with kind of maybe a little bit of a DH platoon between Coby Mayo and Heston Kjerstad, with Kjerstad playing more against those right-handers. I could also see Mayo just being in the minors again to start the year, kind of similar to what they did with Kjerstad this season. But yeah, those will be weapons. And honestly, this offense is just so good. I'm not sure I see them bringing in anyone free agency-wise, and it could be all kind of these internal options for the O's in that opening day lineup 2025. 3 questions down, 6 questions to go. Coming up next, we'll talk a bit about Coby Mayo and his fit on this team, both right now and in the future. We'll chat a bit about Orioles September call-ups and about a reliever that not many people are talking about, but could be a huge boost to the Oriole bullpen down the stretch. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Supply House. Get supplies from the site that's made for the skilled trades, supplyhouse.com. Supplyhouse.com is the reliable way to order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. You can shop at a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 top brands and get your order delivered right to your door with fast shipping from coast to coast. Need help with an order? Get expert support and industry-leading service from the friendliest folks in the business, and talk to a real person every time. Pros in the skilled trades can get a competitive edge by joining SupplyHouse.com's free Trademaster program. Every Trademaster gets access to a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Join the thousands of trade pros already benefiting from their free membership at supplyhouse.com/TM and order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from anywhere with just a few clicks at supplyhouse.com. So back to the mailbag we go with question number 4 of the day, who really came from multiple people. There were multiple different versions of this question. Brian via email. We had Brian and Vernon on Twitter. Matthew via email had a similar question. Basically a combination of, where do you think Koby Mayo fits in once Jordan Westburg comes back this year? And then where does Koby Mayo fit into this team kind of next year and into the future as well? So I combined all of that into one question here. Now, first of all, this is hoping that Jordan Westburg does come back late in the season. I'm confident it will happen as long as his rehab and recovery from the broken hand goes well. Then hopefully maybe like the last week of the regular season, he can get back in there, get some ABs, and be fully healthy and ready for the postseason. That, for me, the non-doctor Connor Newcomb is the best case scenario, I feel like, for Jordan Westburg. When he does come back, Jordan Westburg is your full-time third baseman. Honestly, it would take a lot of production from Koby Mayo in these next 6 weeks to have Jordan Westburg come back and not have an everyday role. And the way that Holiday's swinging it, he's at second, Henderson's at short, you're going to have Westburg at third base. Maybe Mayo could hit enough where he's in more of like a first base DH role when Westburg comes back and you're still getting him at bats. But there's always a good chance Mayo just kind of struggles in this spot. John Mioli wrote about it this week in the Baltimore Banner that he kind of compares Mayo's call-up a lot to Colton Cowser's call-up last year, when it wasn't as much about, okay, this guy is ready, and it was more about this guy's playing well, but more so we have a need at this position in the major leagues because of an injury. Remember, Cowser came up because I believe it was when Mullins and Hicks were both hurt at the same time last year, and the O's needed Cowser. Now this happens where you have, Norby traded, Mateo hurt, and Westburg hurt all at the same time, and you just need Koby Mayo on this roster. And so because of that, there's a chance that he could struggle and he could end up back down in AAA Norfolk before this year ends, just like it did with Cowser. And Cowser, wasn't a factor late in September, wasn't on the postseason roster, but then pulled it together in the next spring training. And we've seen what Cowser has been this year. Now, once again, the front runner for American League Rookie of the Year. But if he's really hitting, we could see some DH, some first base, especially against left-handed pitching. If he's not, he could be some sort of super right-handed pinch hitter, but the fact that the Orioles have brought in Eloy Jimenez and Austin Slater to do some of that tells me that if he's not really hitting and Westburg comes back, Mayo probably just finishes the year in AAA, probably not on the playoff roster, and most likely competes for an everyday role in spring training next year. And that kind of brings me to the next part. Okay, what is the more longer-term future with Koby Mayo? Now, again, going into next year, Westburg at third, Henderson at short, Holiday at second. That is your dream, like everyday infielder. Doesn't matter lefty or righty on the mound. You're sending those three guys out there. But I do think there's a solid chance Ryan Mountcastle is traded this offseason, and that would be the opening for Koby Mayo to be a right-handed hitting kind of first base and DH option who still has the ability to play third if you need him to. That gives you a little more defensive versatility and flexibility than Mountcastle does on the roster, especially playing against lefties. Maybe not an everyday player right away because you've still got to fit O'Hearn and a guy like Heston Kjerstad into one of those DHE first base corner outfield roles. But I think he could find a solid chunk of playing time. There's a chance Mayo's 25 looks a good amount like Kjerstad's 24. I think he would want more than that. That's certainly a possibility. I don't really see him, though, being an everyday lineup staple like from opening day on next year. It's going to take a little more time for him to get to that level. Speaking of Heston Kjerstad, our fifth question of the day comes from Dave on Twitter, who asks, if it's not Heston Kjerstad, which is an interesting caveat here, who are the two most likely September call-ups? Now, remember, there are still September call-ups, but they are very different than they used to be. Back in the day, your roster could expand from 25 to 40 on September 1st. It was insane. Buck Showalter used to hate it. He complained about it all the time. He was kind of right. Buck was right about a lot of things. That was one of them. Now there are 26-man rosters, and the roster expands by only 2 players. So you can go to 28 starting on September 1st. Now, you still have a limit of 14 pitchers, so generally teams add 1 hitter and 1 pitcher on September 1st, and then you do have to go back down to 26 for the postseason. So for the Orioles, honestly, looking at it right now, the hitter addition would be kind of easy. You would just add Heston Kjerstad to the roster. I think that would be pretty self-explanatory, but as Dave asked, if it couldn't be Kjerstad, so let's assume he has some sort of minor injury or something where he can't get called up, who would you go to? And that's where it kind of gets not exciting. I honestly think if the Orioles couldn't call up Kjerstad for whatever reason, they would just kind of bring up some sort of utility bench guy to give them some more defensive versatilities when they're making pinch hitting and changes late in games. Like, I don't think they would call up anyone besides Kjerstad who would really make an impact in the lineup. And that's been kind of different because those sorts of call-ups have been basically Gunnar Henderson a couple years ago and Heston Kjerstad last year. They were plugged into the lineup. If it's not Kjerstad, I don't think it'll be that case this year. My guess would be a guy like Livan Soto, an infielder who can play all three infield positions. Maybe a guy like Nick Maton who can play the infield and the outfield. Just give you a lot of versatility, be a bench guy who doesn't need a lot of at-bats, can maybe pinch run for you a little bit if you need to, just to give your team a little more depth because you're so deep hitter-wise that if it can't be Kjerstad, it's probably a lesser name like that. Now, on the pitching side, you got a lot of options right now, right? You got, you've got your Cade Poviches and your Chase McDermotts of the world on the starting pitching side, and you've got a whole stack of relievers you could choose from. You got your Nick Vespi, your Dylan Tate, your Brian Baker types. There's other guys around there who could make that move. My guess right now would be Chase McDermott. I think at some point in August, the Orioles could kind of start deloading Chase McDermott and plan for him to be an impact reliever down the stretch if they need it for the Orioles. Now, this could be way out in left field, and it could just be Dylan Tate, right? Or Brian Baker. Just bring someone up who's at a big chunk anyway to add another experienced, at least solid bullpen arm to the middle relief. But if you want to go for upside, Chase McDermott moving to the pen, I've been saying this all along, that could be your move that brings you an impact swing and miss reliever in the middle part of the bullpen. Speaking of the middle part of the bullpen, question number 6 comes from Joel on Twitter. How much stock are you putting in Burch Smith? Smith, who was signed by the Orioles after being released by the Marlins, since he's been added to the big league bullpen, he's allowed only 2 runs over 10 innings of work with 6 hits, 12 strikeouts, and only 2 walks. The right-hander was throwing 94 with the Marlins. He's averaging 96 and is up to 97, 98 with his fastball. Guys aren't really squaring it up. His cutter, which was solid in Miami, has turned into a real weapon with the Orioles. They've made some tweaks on his delivery, on his pitches. Now, I don't think Burch Smith is going to be like pitching the 8th inning anytime soon for the Orioles, especially with the bullpen additions they made at the deadline. But I do think they have at least found another Jacob Webb type to be a solid middle reliever for the Orioles down the stretch. And I think Smith has a shot right now to pitch his way onto the postseason roster. That's really what you're shooting for, is a postseason playoff spot. I'm not sure if it's going to hold, but remember when the Orioles brought in Jacob Webb on waivers last August, he came in here and was just dominant. Like, he had like 10 or 12 straight scoreless appearances, became a huge part of the Oriole bullpen. And he did fade a little bit down the stretch. And I could see that being Burch Smith, right? He comes in, he's dominant, then he fades a little bit, maybe is out of favor by the end of the season. But the Orioles do enough to keep him around next year. And now we've seen what Webb has been this year. I mean, where would the Orioles bullpen be without Jacob Webb in 2024? That, I think, could be the future for Burch Smith. We got 3 more questions to get to finish off this episode. Talk a little bit more about relievers specifically. Okay, who's the Orioles closer right now? We'll talk about Cole Irvin, who's surprisingly still in the organization. And then I'll give you my first run at trying to predict the Orioles 2024 playoff roster. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Now, I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But here in the summer, there's just a little bit less going on. Like, yeah, we got the Olympics, and of course, Major League Baseball's on every night, but it's just not as much for the next month or so until football gets kicked off. But still, all you got to do is open the FanDuel app, and you can dream up bets anytime. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer at FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. We've got 3 more mailbag questions to get to on this episode. Question number 7 comes from many. Cole, Aiden, Tucker, all had a version of this via Twitter. Who would be your main 7th, 8th, and 9th inning relievers for the Orioles right now? And that includes the closer position. Because, of course, Craig Kimbrel right now is not the Orioles closer. His last few outings have been in very low leverage. He was even warming up with that 4-run lead on Sunday in Cleveland. Didn't come into the game, though. It was Sir Anthony Dominguez who came in to close it out. So we've already seen this once before this year when Kimbrel struggled and he went into a lower leverage role, but he was still pitching in the 7th and started pitching well and then got back to the closer role and ran off 16, 17 straight outings. I think it was like in that stretch with just 1 earned run. Like, he was pitching really well for a while there after getting that break. So hopefully that happens again and Kimbrel can reassume that role. But say the Orioles tonight, had a 1-run lead in the bottom of the 9th in Toronto. Like, I don't think Craig Kimbrel is getting the baseball in that spot. So the question is, who is? And I think right now it's Yennier Cano. He has gotten the one save chance since Kimbrel kind of went on the fritz. Although it was a 3-run save. It was the Orioles leading 7-4 in the bottom of the ninth in Cleveland on Saturday, and Cano came in and got the job done to secure the win. But a 3-run save and a 1-run save in the ninth are very different animals. The fact that Cano got that spot Saturday tells me it's his job right now. But because Cano's more of a ground ball guy, doesn't miss any bats, he's more suited to be in that 8th inning role. I just like a bat misser, and Craig Kimbrel is still top 10 in strikeout rate in baseball. That's why when he's on, he's still a really, really good closer in the major leagues. But I think right now what the Orioles are going with is some sort of Cionel Perez in the 7th, Seranthony Dominguez in the 8th, Yennier Cano in the 9th. However, I could see pretty quickly here Craig Kimbrel becoming the 7th inning guy like he did in that first stint when he lost the closer role, and then Dominguez and Cano. But what would I like to see right now? I'd honestly like to see Dominguez get those save chances with Cano sticking in the 8th, and then you're just kind of matching up. Before that, you're using Perez, you're using Webb, you're using Kimbrel. If Gregory Soto keeps the command there, you're using him. I mean, heck, Burch Smith has been good enough. Maybe he gets some chances here. Like, the O's bullpen is in a really interesting spot where they certainly got better after adding Dominguez and Soto at the deadline. But now without Kimbrel being that defined 9th inning guy because of how he's been pitching, you just kind of have this like smorgasbord of like good to solid relievers who could save a game, right? And we've seen Perez do it. We've seen Cano do it. We've seen Dominguez get outs in the 9th. We've seen Jacob Webb pick up a save for this team. Of course, we know Kimbrel can do it when he's on. So there's so many guys who have had those chances before, but even Soto like did it in Detroit for a long time before he was traded to the Phillies. But there's not one defined guy. And maybe that's okay because sometimes a bullpen can work better when there's not a defined 9th inning guy. And you can just, you play the matchups. Brandon Hyde plays the matchups all the way up through the 8th. Why not just play him in the 9th as well if you think that's the best way to win, especially if Kimbrel is struggling a bit? He's still going to be part of those matchups, but may not be his 9th inning every time. That's how I think the O's are going to do it. I think, again, it would probably be Cano in a 1-run game here tonight if it happened, but they'll try to get it back to Kimbrel. If not, matching up, I'm not mad at. Like, if you see lefties, go Perez. If you see like an interesting mix, go with Webb. If you see some righties, go with Dominguez. I wouldn't be mad at that at all whatsoever. And like, you know what? If you go to Dominguez and he walks a couple of guys, have Cano ready to come in and get you a big ground ball and get you a double play to get out of it. Like, have other guys ready. I think the Orioles could do that for a little bit here. And that's what they did when Kimbrel lost the job the last time. And it honestly worked when they did it. Could certainly see them doing it again. Question number 8 comes from both Edward and Steady Vacuums on Twitter, who asked, do you think Cole Irvin has any chance of returning to the Orioles this season? Now, Irvin, after just really, really struggling for the last month or so, he was DFA'd right around the trade deadline. And I honestly said it then. I said, listen, Irvin has not been good lately, but he is a starting pitcher who has had success in the past in the big leagues, has 2 more years of team control, is on cost-wise, very team-friendly for that stretch as well. And I just thought, he'll be on waivers, and I thought there was no way he would clear waivers. And I thought at least like a rebuilding team who had just traded away a lot of their pitching at the deadline would at least bring Irvin in to, at the very least, like eat some innings for the remainder of this season and then kind of evaluate what they had in him in the offseason. Just thought, okay, Irvin, give us 5 to 6 innings every 5 days. Just help us survive this season. Like, you don't think the White Sox or the Marlins or somebody like that or the Rockies could have used Cole Irvin? Even with his struggles, I thought they could have. And that's why I was surprised that he cleared waivers and has been outrighted to AAA Norfolk and is remaining in the Orioles organization. And despite his struggles, that is still a positive outcome for the Orioles because they have another depth starter who gives you length, who has big league experience in AAA Norfolk. And that's going to be big for both just the Tides to have innings and also for the Orioles if they need to dip down now. Now, in terms of if he pitches for the O's again this year, I would guess no. The starting depth behind the top 5 right now goes Albert Suarez, who's currently your long man, Cade Povich, who's back in AAA and pitched really well on Sunday, and then Chase McDermott and Cole Irvin. I think McDermott becomes a reliever. Suarez stays the MLB long man. So it's kind of a fight for Irvin and Povich for that next emergency start spot. If the O's got in a spot where they truly just needed like one start on one day as an emergency starter, I think Cole Irvin would be that guy to call up. Maybe if you need a longer sustained starter, they would go back to Povich at some point this year. but there's a chance for Irvin, just kind of unlikely because of how poorly he was pitching. But it is nice to keep him in the org for now. And maybe you can, work on things in the offseason and get him back to be a starting pitching, at least option for the O's in spring training of 25. And then the final question comes from Slam Tonder on Twitter. Nice name right there. What will the playoff roster look like? Now, I'm going to talk about this a lot more generally in September, once we get closer to the Orioles, like clinching a playoff spot and being in the postseason. But the Orioles right now, I believe, have like 98% playoff odds via Fangraphs. So we're still feeling good with them getting into the postseason. So let me take my first crack. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to give you any of the reasoning behind some of the closer choices I'm making. I'm just going to give you the 26 players, and you can do what you want with that in the YouTube comments once this episode is up. All right, 13 hitters and 13 pitchers. 2 catchers, Adley Rutschman, James McCann. I've got, 6 infielders, Jordan Westberg, Gunnar Henderson, Jackson Holliday, Ryan Mountcastle, Ryan O'Hearn, and Ramon Arias. And I have 5 outfielders, Cedric Mullins, Anthony Santander, Colton Cowser, Austin Slater, and Eloy Jimenez / Heston Kjerstad, depending on what kind of handed pitchers the Orioles face. If it's a team with a lot of lefties, Jimenez. If it's a team with mostly righties, Kjerstad. My pitchers usually need 4 starters in the playoffs maximum. So my starters are Corbin Burns, Grayson Rodriguez, Zach Eflin, and Dean Kramer. And my relievers are Yennier Cano, Craig Kimbrel, Seranthony Dominguez, Danny Coulombe, Cionel Perez, Gregory Soto, Trevor Rogers, Jacob Webb, and Chase McDermott. That is my first crack at the Orioles 2024 postseason roster. And that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for sending in your mailbag questions. We'll get to another mailbag at some point here. The Orioles got a lot more off days coming up this month as well. But either way, I will be back tomorrow with another episode as the Orioles are back in action tonight. North of the border, get Ryan Mountcastle in that lineup. Hopefully he can feast on the Jays. Grayson Rodriguez goes for the Orioles. Chris Bassett, the veteran, goes for Toronto. A 7:07 p.m. Eastern time start for the first of 3 up in the 6th. And then I will be back with you tomorrow, recapping everything you need to know from Game 1 between the O's and the Jays. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.